All right, welcome to Cwic Show. My name is Greg Mattson, and I am your host. Our guest today is Christine Sefein. She has been a professor of clinical psychology in the graduate program at Antioch University and has worked in mental health, including as a therapist, for about 18 years. Christine, I want to talk about the therapy industry and what's going on here. Lots of concerns. It seems to me that the woke culture that we're seeing in the United States has kind of inserted itself, it's blatantly inserted itself into the therapy and counseling industry and has turned it on its head in many ways. I'm getting so many different reports on what's happening. What's going on?
Well, thank you so much, first of all, for having me on your show. It's always a pleasure and honor to be able to speak out about what's happening, since it's very difficult to do that in this day and age, in this industry, without being labeled in some way as, my gosh, racist or transphobic or xenophobic or fill in the blanks, all the obics you can imagine. So I really am, honored to be able to talk about it in a really real, authentic way, from being on in the industry, in the inside, right, kind of behind the curtain, especially on the education level. But yeah, there's this sort of concept of social justice hit the industry, I think, many years ago. I went to Antioch as a student, and when I was there, before I went back to teach and all of that, that was in 2005. They were already talking about it, but the way that social justice was defined back then is different, I think, than the way that it is today. Back then, it was about, okay, well, we want to make sure that when you're seeing your clients, you're aware of the fact that, there's this diversity, component that's important, that they're going to have come to you from different cultures and different backgrounds, may not align with what the westernized way of thinking about the world is. And that's sort of this update to what therapy, what we want to be teaching folks who are training to become psychotherapists. Back in the days of Freud, those things were not really discussed, right? And I'm talking now, we've moved so far ahead of that, but so many of those core values of therapy are still there, which is about really being able to listen and dig in and help people bring awareness. But this added layer of culture competencies, actually what they also started to call it, that seemed fair enough. Okay, so to understand that, hey, you're going to be meeting with clients who may not have grown up anywhere near you. They may not have ever had any of the same kinds of experiences as you. So therefore, you always want to remain curious and wondering. So it was innocent enough and it made sense. But at some point, that started to turn into something much bigger that became actually the very opposite of what it sought to do in the beginning. It started to become about understanding, if you are going to be a therapist and you are going to be a social justice minded therapist, that meant activism, that meant going in there and advocating for people who are less than, people who are disenfranchised, people who in some way have not had equal opportunities. And everything then gets placed into these buckets. That's, very, they don't really hold any value or meaning because they're so broad and general and don't leave, any room for nuance. So this bucket of, okay, well, where do we, typically find disenfranchised people and who's causing this disenfranchisement? So taking something that was once a good idea, understanding kind of what, is out there that might be different from what you've known, and kind of being open to understanding that seems like a good idea. And it was that we wanted to learn more about other people's cultures when they seek therapy. They took that and then it turned right back into this very oppressive, closed-minded, closed loop thinking is what I like to call it, where things are very black and white, which is the complete, again, opposite of therapy and psychology, where typically the answer is, well, I don't know. Let's see, let's explore that together, because people are rarely that rigid in their thinking. They're rarely that rigid in the world. People tend to have multiple shades of different ideas and ways of thinking. And what social justice turned into was a way to box and categorize things that really don't belong in a box because it's too closed in. So that started to turn into, well, let's look at where this whole thing started. Oh, gee, white men, patriarchal systems where if you're not a heterosexual white male, you're going to be completely disenfranchised, or you will be discriminated against. And because of that, that's been baked into the system. We are essentially now born into a system where these are the truths, and these truths that you will never succeed in a patriarchal structure under a patriarchal white male, those truths become baked in. This is according to how it's changed, such that there is no way out. No matter what you do, you can't escape this system that's there to really sort of swallow you and to really serve the ruling party, the ruling class, the elite class, which is this white male, broadly. It doesn't matter where that person was born or raised or how, or financial opportunities, whether they, have had access to different resources or not. It doesn't matter. They will always be more. They will always be more privileged. So in and this has happened with many ideas in psychology over the years. Things come out and ideas come out as a way to kind of broaden our horizons as therapists, and then they get taken to the extreme, to this extreme opposite sort of level where it becomes it no longer holds any water or meaning, because it becomes completely, I want to say stereotyped, right? And we try to stay away from those words, and we try to not stereotype others, but that's stereotyping in its own regard, that somebody who's white and male is going to have had this experience versus a woman who is of dark skin and an immigrant, she's going to have had this experience. So the nuances, the color of experience, we'll say, the varying levels, of different, ways that things people are exposed to, ways that they see the world, get completely watered down, for the sake of this one prevalent idea, this structure, which is based upon oppressor oppression, that any structure in this world is based on power, and that power always lies in the hands of the people that are either oppressed or the oppressor. There's nothing in between anymore.
Christine, so as an example, it seems like what's happening is it does in many of the other institutions where critical social justice has, almost all institutions at this period. It's in psychotherapy, it's like, instead of looking at, fundamentals of psychoanalysis, objective truth, it's what's your truth? What is, if you're a woman, if you're a minority, then that's your truth. If you're a white male, then you have this truth. And it just kind of erases these objective truths that the field of psychoanalysis has gone through for so long.
Yes.
Truths, work that are objective for everybody. Yes. But it removes that and puts the focus on, well, here's your skin color, here's your gender, and therefore this is how it needs to be.
Yes, that's absolutely true. So if you were to speak your own truth, say, for example, and it doesn't match the truth that they're feeding you, then you are unaware. So if you were to say, hey, I'm a woman whose parents immigrated here, a million years ago, and this has been my experience, it's already been determined that I need to respond in a certain way, because those ideals, those critical justice ideals in psychotherapy have already told me that if I don't acknowledge the fact that I'm underprivileged, if I don't acknowledge that I'm disenfranchised, I'm actually ignoring this sort of piece of myself. There's this deep unconscious hate that I must have, that I'm not tapping into, or I would see that these systems are oppressing me. So not only is it feeding, telling people who are the ruling class what they've done, it's also telling people who aren't how they should be thinking about themselves. And if we don't think that way about ourselves or about the ruling class, who's the expert on ourselves? It's always been known in psychotherapy, the biggest expert or most knowledgeable expert on you is you. And now we're saying, no, That expert isn't you. You're not conscious of what's happening to you. So I'm going to tell you what's happening to you. And this is the way that we're going to practice psychotherapy now. It's going to be digging in and you understanding that deep down, you actually hate yourself. Deep down, you actually wish you were white. And deep down, you're giving these people a free pass. So you need to understand that. Or the opposite end. Deep down, you are racist. You just don't see it. Let me point it out to you. Let me tell you why you are. It's part of your DNA.
So this is the strange thing. I mean, of all places for this to come into fruition, for social justice to plant itself and grow the way it has, here's an industry where you're trying desperately to help someone in therapy, right? And to do that, you need certain introspection.
Yes.
And you need to look at yourself and say, well, what can I do? And how do I build strength? And how do I overcome?
Yes.
Right. How do I overcome the problems that I'm facing or the way I'm thinking or whatever it might be? And yet social justice comes in and it completely contradicts this idea of empowering a patient.
Yes.
Because the problem with social justice is the problem is always out there.
Yes.
Right. The problem's out there. You're being oppressed. You're being subject to the patriarchy. You're being, whatever. And if we can just change them, then you're going to be better off. Or,
yes.
The toxic shaming that's coming from your family or your friends is the problem. It's not that you need to overcome something.
Yes.
So isn't this completely antithetical to, I think you brought up the term resilience, to
yes.
being able to build resilience for someone who
yes.
desperately needs it?
Yeah, it's the antithesis, and it keeps people very weak, because if you're in a situation where you're saying, okay, it's everybody else that needs to change, these are the systems that are wrong, and that's a very helpless way to approach something. There's no way that this one person's going to be able to go out and change the system. And so the focus on the externals, they call it the external locus of control, where the control resides is externally. If this external situations change, that by default changes you, rather than saying, wait a minute, okay, here's what I can control and here's what I can't control. So what I can control is me. What I can control is how I see myself. What I can control is how I express myself and understand the world around me. That is how I lead myself to a better state of being, a better state of being able to make choices, and understanding where it is I do have a choice, where it is I do have an opportunity to act, versus making everybody else, to put it just very kind of basically here, everybody else is responsible for my problems in the world and what's happened to me but myself. And to some extent that might be true for certain people, but that does nothing to empower. It does nothing to strengthen their inner, core, their inner being, their inner sense of value, their inner sense of resilience. How do I get up and move forward, even against, a system that is set up to make me fail? I don't even believe that necessarily, that these systems are all designed specifically for that in every situation with every type of person all over. It's way too of an umbrella. But let's just say, for example, that was a belief that somebody held. Still, there's room for self-agency, self-reflection, self-efficacy. There's still room for somebody to be able to carve out an area of life and of their world and identify what that is and make a different choice. So no matter which way you cut the pie, even if you do kind of have this sweeping belief in all the powers that be that are against you, there still is a moment, a play, and that especially comes through with teenagers. They don't have a lot of choice when they're living at home with the parents and the structure that they're in. And that's the one thing that we would always help, teenagers or children get to that point of, okay, well, right now, maybe you don't have this kind of control. You can't change your parents' mind. How can you learn to live with what can you do to create a better existence for yourself? So even to think in an extreme fashion that these people are going to hold me down, there's still an opportunity there to look internally and see what you can actually do about it. The problem with that critical justice is it cuts off every single opportunity for you to do that, because it keeps the person focused on the external. It keeps them focused on the parts in which they don't have control rather than the parts where they do, and say, okay, well, how do you then empower yourself and become, one thing they can't take from you is your mind, right? I mean, there's certain ways to be able to help people who even have that closed-minded way of thinking. And most people don't. It's something they're fed. But even if they did, let's say, where do you have places that you can't control? Like I said, with the teens, it's a great example, and kids, where they don't have a lot of control in the situations that they're in often. How do we work with that? We didn't sit there and just say, well, yeah, go hate your parents and hate the world and hate life. It's okay. Well, having said all that, we get it. What can you do to be you, to still be me, to still bring something to the table, still have some sort of ability to control yourself?
So, Christine, would in the therapy industry, the psychotherapy industry, are therapists being encouraged to validate the perceptions of a world of microaggressions and victimhood?
Yes, 100%. Because in some weird way, and I'll give you this example, and I may have talked to you about this before, Greg, I think we mentioned this before, but, I have a colleague who was telling me about a client of one of his colleagues, and, they were kind of consulting about this client's problem and what to do about it. And the client was of some ethnic background, and I don't know what it is. And she was complaining that there was this microaggression. So comment was made at work. I don't know what it was, but these microaggressions, these kind of, subtle, I guess, communications that are considered to be harmful or offensive to other people, like, I don't know, Asians can't drive. Okay, that's one that we kind of hear a lot. Okay, fine. So there was some kind of microaggression of that sort made to this woman. And the advice from the therapist was not to kind of look at how that affected her, why she feels that person's comment holds so much power. What does that person even mean in the scope of her life? This is a person that's making a comment that has nothing to do with whether or not she will succeed in the world or not. It's a comment. Okay. So what's that about? What's happening for her in that? And if she does feel upset, well, how can she have a conversation with this person? And is it worth it? These are things you look at in therapy. Like, what's the payoff, to go down that road? No. So that would be what a traditional, maybe kind of therapist would have looked at with that person, maybe kind of come up with, okay, what was triggering about that? Did it remind you of something? Did it, put you back, 20 years ago in this one spot in your life where you felt X, Y, and Z, and it brought it all back? Okay, that's great. That's not what happened. The critical justice viewpoint lens on that particular case was, let's empower you. So here again, a wonderful word of empowerment, right? We love this word about empowering. Let's empower you. So these words get weaponized and hijacked. Okay. Let's empower you to go to HR and to file a formal complaint. So now this woman is saying, as the client is saying, oh my goodness, well, I should go file a complaint toward HR. That's discrimination. It's racist. It's discrimination. It's, it's sexism because she was a woman. The man who made the comment was a man. That was the approach. That's the critical lens. And the rest of the people that were part of this consultation group were cheering on the therapist. Like, yeah, that's great advice. Good job. That's what she should do. Right. So that's an example on a very small level. Yes. Of what that mindset, that lens, how that shifts to then really affect the client in a negative way. That wasn't the right way to do it. It wasn't going to be the most effective, but that's what happened. So she got all riled up, and everybody who was in that consultation room said, good job, therapist, Jane Doe, for guiding that client that way.
So, I mean, it's like
empowering,
a lot of
right?
postmodernism. It's like a lot of postmodernism and changing the meaning of words.
Yes.
Empowerment should be that resilience, right? Okay.
Yes,
I'm building this empowerment, this self-empowerment, which is resilience to overcome the adversity and the difficulties of life.
Yes. Overcome the adversity. Understand, why does that even matter to you so much? Who is this person to you? I mean, there's ways to kind of do that, right? To empower yourself, that you don't have to let something have that kind of control over your psyche.
Well, it's activism. It changes it to empowerment is more like, how do you become an activist?
Yes. How do you become an advocate, activist? And your therapist now, rather than being the sound, okay, people have a lot of sounding board, the person who is providing you unconditional positive regard, the person who's non-judgmental. It's basically taking all of that out of the role of what a therapist is there to do, and having the therapist become the activist who now guides your activism, your advocacy. Your therapist now is sort of leading that charge.
And that critical lens is always that way, right? You always seem to have to include this activism. It becomes like this works-based religion.
Yes.
That
it is a religion in its own way. And then, you're then now furthering the narrative that person needs to depend on the therapist. They need to depend on this other person to fight for them, to tell them how to advocate. In its own way, it disempowers the client and keeps the client stuck, which is the entire sort of antithesis again of what therapy is supposed to do for somebody, is to keep them stuck rather than them making their own decisions or looking through, a lens where they have the final say in their own life, not the therapist telling them what the final say is and how to do it.
So use the term learned helplessness.
Yes.
And it seems, here's the concerning thing, is it's not just a matter of, okay, I'm going to move you from being self-empowered to being an activist and the problems out there and not just with you, but they're there for a reason in the first place. There's a problem. It could be a big problem with the way they're thinking, and something going on with their mental health, or just life is just overwhelming them, whatever it might be, right? And yet you're almost teaching them to be more helpless.
Yes.
In this scenario.
Yes.
It's like deflecting.
Yes.
You're deflecting the real problems that you might have internally to the outside. And wouldn't your anxiety and your depression and everything else just continue to move up in this? It might be like a Band-Aid for a short period of time.
Yes.
But the underlying problems there, mental health isn't being solved.
No, it's not, because that is when somebody else is in control of your story, they're in control of your narrative, they're in control of your life, they're in control of, the right answer, then you're placing that, then that person has lost any control themselves to create what that story is, to create their own sense of meaning around their lives and around what's happened to them, because somebody else is telling them how to think. And that's, one of the big issues that you run into with your people that are working with minority, populations, race-wise minorities, automatically assume that they all have been through a certain amount of disenfranchisement, racism, marginalization, being overlooked for opportunities over somebody else who's white or whatever. That's not a fair statement to say that every minority has ever felt that way. But you have these people that are now telling you, well, this is what's happening. And me, as your social justice warrior, I'm going to help you see it. And I'm going to help you work on fighting back. And that big word fight, fight, is the antithesis of therapy in and of itself. There's, an aggressiveness around that concept that isn't what therapy is supposed to be, which is actually more disarming. In a sense, it's supposed to not, it's not about fighting in this way that creates actually a lot of aggressiveness. And they've done studies to show even talking about fighting raises this cortisone level in your body or cortisol level in your body that gets you ready to fight or flight. You have people that are in there that maybe have been fighting. You have people in there that maybe are already, have had this trauma history of fighting and fleeing and whatever they've needed to do, that kind of reactivates this part of them that maybe is not in the best interest to do. Maybe the answer here isn't fighting. Maybe the answer here is an entire perspective shift, an entire awareness shift, or an understanding shift. And when those people tell you, I don't feel like I've been disenfranchised, and you're telling them as a therapist, but you have been, I'm going to teach you why, negates the whole idea of somebody having their own, story to tell, or their own narrative, or their own understanding.
Well, it's indoctrination to a very
100%.
vulnerable person. You're in a vulnerable situation, and it's indoctrination.
Yes, 100%.
So what, you've been a professor at a university level, and you're So you've been involved in teaching, and you see what comes around as far as teaching. How much, what's happening on what you're being told to teach
Yes.
in these courses to those that are going into psychotherapy and psychoanalysis? Has that changed a lot?
It's changed. It's changed a lot. When I first started teaching, it was 2017. It was right after Trump was elected. And right before I started teaching, I was an adjunct professor. I wasn't on campus that much. I was only teaching. Adjuncts teach like 1 or 2 classes. They're usually people who are practicing in the field in any kind of graduate program. They're people who are practicing in the field usually and come in and do 1 or 2 courses of teaching. Where I taught, I think 75% of the classes were taught by adjuncts. They wanted to have people who are real life, working in the field to come in and teach. So I wasn't all that affected with what was happening politically on the campus until I became full-time. Mm-hmm. So during that time, though, there were inklings. I started to hear about, they had organized protests on campus through the psychology department on, Trump having won the election and whatever. And I thought, well, this is really a problem, because how come we're politically aligning with something? This doesn't seem right. But again, I was an adjunct professor, so I let it go. I was teaching grief. And I thought, well, okay, you know what? This doesn't involve me, so I'm going to stay out of it. So I just went and I taught my grief class. People would bring up some politics every now and again, and I would squash it and say, that's not what we're here to do. And we're not here to rank whose grief is worse than another person's. We're not here to do all that. This is what we're going to be talking about. So I used to squash those conversations, and people were pretty respectful, at leaving that out of my class. I didn't care what they were doing elsewhere, but in my class, you're not going to do that. And that was fine. So, it wasn't as much in my face until I started to teach more and more. And I eventually got hired on as like this part-time affiliate. So I needed to have office hours. And then eventually I was hired full-time as a faculty. And that's when I really saw, you'd walk up to the psychology department, and the minute you walk through the doors, there's like posters all over the place that are intolerance will not be tolerated in like a fist, mm-hmm. and the rainbow colors of the LGBT, Q plus, et cetera, community all over the place. And I would walk in the doors and I felt you could feel the aggression. You could hear the conversations in the hallways of the core faculty arguing and complaining about the administration and whatever's going on, that they're not taking certain things seriously enough. And we need to have these messy conversations. And they started a series called Messy Conversations after that, where we really look at the social justice, injustices, and that us as professors, we must bring social justice, concepts into the classroom. And I just kind of put my head down and just looked the other way and thought, well, I'm not doing that, because that's not what I'm here to teach. And that should be fine. But the pressure grew quite significantly. The first time I heard the word woke was probably in 2018. I had never even heard of it, didn't know what it meant. And it came out of a student from one of my classes. I was teaching a group therapy class. He'd, said something in a reflection paper, thought I hated men or whatever, which is, I'm partnered, so it's kind of funny. Anyway, but he kind of made a comment like that. And I brought it to his advisor, and I said, who's also my boss, actually. And I said, I don't know what to do about this. I know he's kind of struggling in this kind of setting. I don't really know what's going on. I wasn't really that bothered. I knew it was something going on with him. And I said, do you think he's really ready, if he cannot handle this kind of, discourse? And, she said, oh, gee, he's just become woke. And she was Black. Oh, gee, he's just become woke. And now he's my student. I mean, now he's going to be transferring to me as his advisor because he's woke. And I said, woke? I don't really understand what that means. And she goes, whoa, Christine's understanding what has been done to him as a Black man his whole life. And I just, kind of went, oh my God, this is big. This has become a huge thing. And this is coming from the actual, it's coming from the department. It's not just the school, it's the Department of Psychology. Mm-hmm. Even the school, we had all these other liberal arts kind of majors, whatever, but from the Department of Psychology, she was my boss. And he's going to go see her as his advisor, because Christine, who else is going to understand what a Black person has been through in this country other than a Black advisor? Of course, I'm going to accept him to be my advisee. And I said, okay, you don't think he'd benefit from being with an advisor that has a different background? Maybe he'll learn some. Are you kidding? Nobody can understand what we've been through. No one. And that was the last time I ever brought that up. It's the last time I brought up that word. It's the last time I ever asked a thing about it. And I said, okay, I know what I'm dealing with now. Can I continue to teach here? And for a while, I did, until we got directives that required us to start incorporating social justice concepts into the material, into every single class that we taught. Because up until that point, we were fairly independent. Adjuncts are very independent. They just kind of come and go. No one really knows what's happening. But I was hired as a full-time person eventually, and I was independent too, because I taught great classes. I was probably in like the 98th percentile in terms of, the evaluations I would get. I always scored well. They loved me there, and it was fine. So they kind of left me alone. So I just hid behind that. And I would pose challenging questions to the students. Well, and this one was the big one because Trump was such a big sort of piece, and I said to them, what would you do if your client voted for Trump? You're saying you're not going to work with somebody who voted for Trump? And the students would just, they were just horrified. It's as though we sucked all the air out of the room for a second. And I said, that's not real therapy. That their political affiliation has absolutely nothing to do with your ability to work with somebody. You guys are saying, they were treating it as though, and many times you'd hear these students say, I'll never work with a perpetrator of sexual abuse. Like that was a big, who could you not work with if you were, currently practicing therapist today? We always ask those questions. They likened somebody who voted for Trump to somebody who was a sexual predator, a DV, maybe perpetrator, to domestic violence perpetrator, somebody who raped a child. They likened that political figure into that whole idea, to that evilness, I guess you'd say. And that's, you kind of realize, all right, well, you're playing with a totally different set of cards here. Is it infiltrated enough that I can't teach in any meaningful way if that is not, that I'm not going to be able to teach because it's too injected into the class? The answer was I could fight it off. There's that word fight. I could fend it off for a period of time until 2020, when George Floyd was killed, when he was murdered. That's when something that was really boiling over just fell right off the cliff and just exploded. Then it became a mandate, in not so many words, that the professors always included a piece of social justice, and that one thing we needed to evaluate the students for is how social justice minded they were when they would speak in class.
Was that included in their scores as a student at all?
Yes. The evaluation
it's like an ESG mark.
Yes.
Yeah.
You had to write in there, does this person have enough, social competency or cultural competency to fight for social justice change, just something along those lines, where the wordings out became what the evals were. And then it was like, well, if you don't have that component in your class, how are you going to measure that? So that's what we needed to do, was put a component in the classroom that could measure that for this rubric of evaluation that we were doing.
Would you say, I don't think this is that way yet in the field because you have so many therapists that have been there for many years, but would you say in education of psychotherapy that social justice has trumped the primary purpose at this point, at least at your university? Would you say that overall?
100%. Yeah. They care much more about that than they do about somebody's ability to, be, in the therapeutic relationship is one of the most sacred sort of intimate relationships that there could ever be, because you have people telling you things that they don't tell their spouse, their partner, their kids, their family, anybody else. You may be the only person that's the holder of the knowledge of this person's story, of this person's experience. And so the tenderness of that and the intimacy of that is something to not, in any way kind of belittle or devalue. When you start to inject, though, that when you take away from helping people understand how to build that intimacy with a client, that becomes replaced or overshadowed. Or second, to the social justice goals and the initiatives, agenda, essentially, then that harms the ability to ever reach that level of intimacy in a relationship that you want to be able to have with your client, so that they'll tell you anything. It's like a therapist who said, and I'll even use myself as an example. I had, we require students to go to therapy too. I really liked that because they got a chance to kind of understand what it was like on the other side. But, so during that time I had, seen my own therapist, and then I had stayed with this person for a while. And when that person commented, on, well, I just hope that your partner's family or your partner, didn't, vote for Trump or wasn't a Republican or something along. The word Trump came in there, followed by, a whole lot of other words. It's not about me liking Trump or anybody in my family liking. That wasn't what was offensive. It was about, wow. So let's say if I were to tell him that did happen, he would change how he feels about me as a client. And I've been with him for years at that point because I stayed with him after I graduated. That was where the issue was. And that for me as a client, I shut down completely. And it wasn't, again, so much about what I thought or if he was right or wrong or who voted or didn't vote for it. It had nothing to do with that. It was about, I can't tell you anything. I can't just tell you ever. Now I have to be careful as to what I tell you. You've ruined my ability to be able to be 100% authentic with you.
Yeah,
that's where it was a problem.
I mean, this is horrifying, Christine. I'll be honest. It's horrifying what's going on in the industry. I want to read from your previous employer, your Antioch University. All right. I've got the webpage up here. And this is from the, let me get this right. The counseling and therapy focus. That's what you're going into. Okay.
That's right.
And it says prepare for a life of helping others through counseling and therapy. At the bottom paragraph here, it says our environment fosters professional and personal growth and inspires your thinking as you develop a personal philosophy of psychological, social, and cultural change.
Yep.
Right. And then right below it in their mini episode of their podcast, the mini episode is mental health justice at Antioch.
Yep.
Right. That's what they're putting forward on their homepage.
Yes.
With this.
Yes.
And if you go to the American Psychology Association, Psychological Association, if you go to Psychology Today, it's the same thing. They've got it's right front and center. It is justice. Yes.
And the APA officially, I believe, which is that regulates the psychologists in this country, has put out a statement saying that they support reparations. I mean, it just.
What does that have to do with therapy?
It does. It has nothing. It just doesn't have anything to do with therapy. So it's, LMU, and I've made this statement before. I mean, they LMU, so Loyola Marymount University's LMU, it's in, California, it's in LA. It's one of, it's got a pretty good psychotherapy program, clinical psychology program, but it's a Jesuit school. So private Jesuit school, you don't really expect to hear a whole lot, this kind of stuff from them, but they actually, the president of their school, made a statement, and I'm just going to have to just read this to you because it was really horrifying. So they came to me and said, would you be interested in teaching with us and whatever? And I said, well, this is what I think about social justice. If you believe I need to align with any particular philosophy or ideology, and I can't teach as a trusted professional in the industry who has a lot of experience and obviously good reputation. I mean, I got scouted by them. Then I'm not going to be a good fit, and I don't want to damage the school. But if you're open to having me teach my way, kind of a thing. And so, their response was thanks, but no thanks. With this quote, LMU is dedicated to eradicating systemic racism and addressing the histories and systems of injustice perpetrated against POC, people of color, perpetrated against POC. Doesn't even sound human. While also taking responsibility for our institutional complicity in the perpetuation of white supremacy. That is the statement from, in quotes, the president of the school. So that's the entire philosophy upon which that whole program lies. It's an Antioch #2. I mean, it's the same idea. Mm-hmm. That's what's happening everywhere. This is why I can't say one school's better than the other. Somebody asked me the other day, if you want to be a therapist, where do you go to school these days? And I said, maybe you want to try Florida. I mean, I hate to say it, but you might find a school there that has sort of an anti-whatever. I don't know, but that's luck. good luck. Right. And
I've got a lot of affiliation with Brigham Young University. You think that's really conservative.
Yes.
It's everywhere, right?
It's everywhere.
And, I don't say it's everywhere, but as far as you go into the social sciences, if you go into family life, they call it, if you go into anything where you're going to be taking courses about therapy, and it's the same way. You walk down the halls and it's the exact same thing. You find out exactly what this department is all about.
Yes.
Very quickly.
It's very sad.
This is a little bit of a firecracker topic here, but even more than what we're already talking about. But what about therapy and gender ideology? What are the problems that we see there with what we've already talked about in kind of this victimhood enabling process? What are the problems with bringing gender ideology and social justice into therapy?
I mean, it's highly problematic. It's just, it's like somebody decided that social justice was a great umbrella for all these other movements to kind of jump onto and ride the coattails of, to be sort of covered under this umbrella of social justice. So you got those folks that are jumping in there too. And, here's the thing, and this is something that I could get totally bashed for. They've done a lot of studies about transgenderism and transgender, and they found that there's a certain 1% or so of the population that they could point to scientifically where they would say are actual transgender, meaning that somehow at some point while their fetus was, being developed in the womb of the mother, something happened where the part that desires sex or the part that desires, the partnership and the intimacy of sex and all that did not match up with the body. They will say that there are studies that say that, okay, scientific studies. The percentage of that, some studies will say it's 1.8 or 9%. Some will say it's under 1%. Nobody has even said it was 2%. Okay, having said that, let's pretend that that's true. Okay, let's just suppose for a minute that's true. 1% to less than 1% is a teeny tiny fraction of a population that's almost unnoticeable. Okay, in terms of it being a scientific outcome that somebody really does feel that they're in the wrong body. Okay, having said all that, the fact that you would know that at the age of 12 or 13, or wake up one day and decide that you are not the body that you were assigned to, is highly problematic, because you have not formed your entire cognitive development, and sexual identity has not been really fully shaped by the time that you're that age. And most of the time, those people who are transgender, and I know one that I worked with from a long time ago, don't really authentically support this transgender movement that's happened, because it's very, it's exploitative in its own way. It's now that, making special exceptions for them or special acknowledgements, or in some way pulling them out. It's almost like watching monkeys at a zoo. And that's almost what they've done, is that they're this group, and we're all standing there at the zoo watching them and clapping for them to do tricks, and for them to, it's very dehumanizing what they've actually done. Those people that are transgender by some kind of authentic place just want to be treated like people. They just want to be treated like everybody else. If they get their reassignment surgery, they just want to be able to live like that. They don't want to be running around. And again, I can't speak for them, but I will speak on behalf of somebody I know who's very close to me, who has really had it with that entire movement, and was also kicked out of the club for coming out against it. Okay. Mm-hmm. And he's a social worker by trade from a long time ago, won an award. The award got detracted for him saying the same thing. We just are people. We don't want this compelled speech of the pronouns and this and that. So the one issue I have when you have the really extreme right, okay, that say it doesn't exist and it's against God, I don't believe that. Then I have the extreme left over here that is treating these people like they're monkeys at a zoo, and that they're performing tricks and they're, or circus acts, and we're sitting there praising them and, oh, how cute, and patting them on the head and giving them money in the tip jar. Those two extreme sides, I think, are completely just damaging for that whole entire movement. Mm-hmm. And they're incorrect, and they're not aligned with any real sense of fact.
Agreed. Mm-hmm.
That's it. And so I think that's where there's a huge problem with them sort of exploiting. So it's like, what is the end game? What do you get out of doing that? I mean, that's a whole nother political conversation, probably on for another show. But that is where they have completely gotten it wrong. And it's the same thing with minorities in general. Most minorities coming from the Middle East are Republican, by the way. They're very conservative. Let's not say Republican, not even a party. They're conservative in their value set. They small government, family values. They don't want any of this crap. They don't want handouts. So again, when all this is kind of done to support this disenfranchised people of color, they're not getting a beat for what people actually want. It's just another, again, there are people that are benefiting from this. There's a lot of people that, obviously are going to make some kind of money or name for themselves, kind of riding the coattails of a movement that really doesn't hold a whole lot of water for most of the people that supposedly are impacted by this movement, so to speak. What transgenderism has done for people who are truly transgender is really kind of nothing. Mm-hmm. They don't care about the pronoun issue. That's not their deal. They don't care about, the having, the drag queen story time bullshit thing that they're doing wherever they're doing that. That's not, again, it's a circus show. It's an act. That's not what they truly align with. They just want to live and be people and not be discriminated against. And gays want to marry because they just want to marry and have a family and a life. Like, that's it. They don't want all of this extra. So you have to kind of ask yourself, where is this coming from? That it has to be a movement on steroids.
Yeah, it's the universities. I call it the religion of academia, that it is sprouting out from there. And it's, we used to think that, well, just Hollywood and the media was kind of like the artists were the those that were at the fountain of culture.
Yes.
It's not that way anymore.
No, it's not.
It's the universities. They are spewing out this indoctrination and this cultural shift. In America, we've got all of our kids going through the system.
Yes.
What do we expect?
Yes.
Right.
There's a great book out there that's written by a woman called Maria Keffler, and it's called Detrans Detoxify. I think Desist, Detrans Detoxify, getting your child out of the gender cult. And her daughter was maybe 13. She's a social worker. Her daughter was maybe 13, going through this whole, I'm a boy, the whole thing. And she talks about her journey of kind of helping her daughter sort of identify what was really going on with her and why she was having sort of this, desire to connect with this group or with this movement. And kind of what she came to find was it really didn't have anything to do with her sexuality or gender at all. It had to do with some other deep-seated whatever. But you have these groups here that are promising you some sort of salvation or some sort of release from all of your problems and all of your, angst. If you just, it's because you're a girl. That's the problem, that now you need to become a boy. And so she really kind of walks parents through, like, one by one, what she did. And it wasn't about telling her you're wrong or don't think that, or those kids are weirdos. She actually just sat and listened. Okay, well, what is it that you're thinking? And how are you feeling about this? And where is this coming from? And, the idea there, the point is that it isn't really coming from a gender dysphoria place at all. It was coming from a lot of different other struggles she was having. But you have this movement, you have these things that are here that are so enticing. Like, hey, come with us and you'll feel like you're a part of the group too. Hey, come with us and you'll belong. These kids are watching. These groups
get a lot of likes on social media.
Yeah, you got your likes. In class, you're getting you're getting clapped and you get the special certain treatment or whatever. And they want to belong. There's this need to belong, especially as a child or a teen. You want to belong to something. This is a very easy way to belong and to pull people, because the more that that's on display and that they're rewarded, for that, the more that kids are going to want to just be part of the group. They're going to want to join in, whether they believe or they don't believe. It's irrelevant. On the surface, maybe they do believe, but deep down they don't. But this is the way you make friends. This is how you get on board with the cool, group or whatever's happening. And the problem with it is, it's not just this fad that just goes away. You have medical, operations and medical, puberty blockers, things that parents are doing actively in the state of California to help their kids or assist their kids to transition. Because the therapists are saying, if you don't acknowledge it, your kid's going to kill himself one day. Mm-hmm. If you don't acknowledge it, your kid's going to.
I've heard that many times too.
So the therapists collude with this. the school is colluding with this, and all of a sudden, if you mean anything or going to matter, you want to be a part of something. That's part of what it is to be that age, is wanting to be accepted. Here's a great way to jump on it. And again, I don't think it's as simple as I'm saying it, but I guess I'm trying to make the point that these things are artificially manufactured. That's my point. Mm-hmm. It's not an authentic core, thing or institution or way of being that is what's bringing kids along. It's manufactured to do that.
So, Christine, ending up here, we're becoming a nation of therapy, right? I mean, there's therapy everywhere, and I'm not putting therapy as a whole down. I think it can be very good, right? Communicate, talk things out, have somebody to listen when you don't have someone to listen. But there a lot of Fortune 500 companies now. I mean, in larger companies, you've got therapists in-house. They're sitting there in the office, and there's therapy is becoming a common part of our culture. So, if these tentacles of social justice are wrapped around therapy, and that becomes a bigger part of our lives, how do you distinguish if you're going to go that route, or you're going to have your kids go that route? How do you find the right therapist? How do you know you're not putting your kid or yourself into greater danger by going down that route?
I mean, that's a great question. And it's a tough, I don't know that I have an answer for that. I mean, there's actually a really interesting website called conservativetherapist.com. And I think that they're pretty good. I looked through that and I just kind of wanted to see what they were doing. And they seem to have more conservative values. And I mean, you're talking about gay therapists on there too. This is not about conservative in the sense of your political beliefs. It's about conservative therapy values, that we're really there to kind of, create this relationship and unconditional positive regard, et cetera, do no harm, all of those things. And they seem
conservative in that regard might just be anti-woke. They're not going to allow.
That's all it is. Yeah. Right. It's not like, oh my gosh, anti-gay.
Who are you voting for?
No.
And
yes, it's just anti-woke. It's going back to conservative values. It's going back to, the importance of having a family structure. It doesn't tell you, what kind of structure that is, but a family structure, which is important, that kind of thing. And I found some interesting people there. The big thing, I think, as adults, you can maybe go in there and be a little discerning when you ask questions. What is your, orientation, therapeutic orientation, modality? What is your philosophy when you practice? What lens do you use? What kinds of goals, do your clients come to you for? Like, what are your other clients coming to see you about? Maybe getting a sense to see who they treat and why, and what kinds of, philosophies do you practice, type of thing. I mean, you have to do a lot of interviewing to see what they're like and who goes to them, what they practice. Now, it's more tricky if you're a parent, because you need the therapist to really be aligning with you as the parent, in addition to maybe helping the child, because when the therapist aligns with the child and they're coming home and starting fights with their parents and saying, well, my therapist said so. And then the therapist brings in the parents with the child, and the therapist tells you, listen, your child is telling you that they are not, that your male son is really a girl. You need to be calling her by her name, or she's a cat and you need to put a litter box in the house. True story. The parents are so scared, which obviously they would be, that if they don't do this, their kid's going to kill themselves. Well, 90% of the time, they probably won't. There's something else that's going on that's creating that feeling of, self-destruction or self-harm, that you need a therapist who's going to be able to dig deeper than that with you. So I think it's just more important, than ever to really grill the therapist and interview them. Well, my kid's trans, like, what is your take on that? When my kid is upset that I won't use the pronouns they and zer and she, I guess is one of them, whatever it is. What's your take on that? What's your how are you going to help us as a family get through this? How are you going to help my child and our family be able to continue on in a loving relationship? Again, no such thing as perfect. They're going to rebel, but a loving relationship. You need to be asking those questions. And if if the therapist says, well, the child, I work with the kid and what, the main thing you want to hear is we need to work as a family and a team. You as parents are going to be involved in this. We are going to talk about this as a team. Those are the kinds of things you want to hear the therapist saying. And what are their thoughts about transgender youth? I would ask them straight up, what do you think about transgender youth, 12 and up? What do you think about that? Mm-hmm. And if they tell you, well, there are, then you need to stop and think. If they can't give you any other answer than that, then that's mm-hmm. a red flag to you, asking questions directly, that's all you can really do.
That's good advice.
Therapist is good.
I wanted to ask you, so you're kind of rare in your field then. I mean,
yes.
honestly,
yes.
at least in the way things are going, and especially in education.
Yes.
I know your parents were immigrants. They came in, they fulfilled the American dream, so to speak, or at least they worked their way through.
Try to, yes.
making a massive change in their life.
Yes.
Do you think that has some effect on how you think about these things?
Yes.
I mean, just coming in, it's hard work, it's sacrifice, yes. it's family.
Yes.
And then you live that way, you're brought up that way. Yes. And then you see these other ideologies and it's like, this is not what I was taught. This is not what I think is right.
Yeah, I have a really big, I absolutely believe that has a lot to do with how my viewpoint on the world and on life has been shaped because, with my parents, look, they were immigrants and they spoke Arabic. Okay. Over here, even people that are immigrants, this is over 45 years ago, Spanish is something a language a lot of people know here. Materials are written, in English and Spanish nowadays. That's no such thing as, an Arabic interpreter back then. That's almost, completely rare. So they have to learn the language from the beginning when they got here, all of it. And there was no, we didn't get, I took the city bus when I was 8 years old to get around. I knew how to do that. I knew how to go to the bank and I knew how to do all these things to make me self-sufficient because my parents were working a lot. And that was just what was required. It was, mm-hmm. we're here in America to work, pull yourself up by the bootstraps. If you lay down in a ditch and cry because somebody upset you at school or called you a bad name or bullied you, bullies have been around since the beginning of time. They got bullied. I was bullied. This is nothing new, but the way that it was handled or the way that we were taught to kind of stand up and march forward, you can sit and cry all you want, but that's not going to pay your bills. You can sit and they wanted us to really learn how to have a tough skin and how to also be able to withstand the pressures of life in general, whether it was social pressures, financial pressures. We were never going to meet, the standard of what most kids I went to school with did, with nice fancy clothes, all that. We didn't have anything. So there was not a poor me aspect to this. And it wasn't that America was perfect either, but it's that at least here we can do our thing. We can practice our religion. We can say what we want. And our kids have the opportunity to do something better. If we come to America and they only have a 5% chance of succeeding, that's fine. In Egypt, they have a 0% chance of succeeding. So let's take the 5% chance. Mm-hmm. That's always been their motto. Let's take whatever teeny chance, as long as it's over 0, it's better than what they have in Egypt. Yeah. So that was the mentality. So I think that's why I also have had a hard time being empathetic for people that just kind of wanted, snowflakes, if you will, crawling. Yeah.
And I think that's so often the case. You mentioned it earlier in the interview here, that it's so often the case with immigrants that are coming in. It's like they've already seen the alternative.
Yes.
Right? They've seen the alternative.
Yes.
They've lived under it.
Yes.
And that makes a big difference. Even a lot, you look at the immigrants from Africa, it's just, they're all usually the same way. We come here, this is a much better opportunity.
Yes.
And that's the case most of the time. And yet when they see the woke stuff, they're like, what is going on?
Yes.
Or those from Eastern Europe who have lived this and been through it. And they're saying, what are you doing with this? This is the same thing that we experienced.
Absolutely. It is not them. That's not the group that has manufactured what we need to do for POC, the people of color. It's not from the people who immigrated.
It's a very specific group.
Exactly.
So anyway, Christine, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your wisdom and your knowledge with us.
Yes,
really
pleasure.
Appreciate it. And I hope we can have you back.
So much. Yes, absolutely. Good speaking with you, and Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, all of it.
Merry Christmas.
Okay. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.